Hey everyone, thanks so much for being here with us today. And of course, especially Gesche Haas, who is the incredible founder and CEO of Dreamers Doers. Gesche, thank you so much for making time for us today.
So honored to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. I know you have a ton going on, so we appreciate you and your time. I love that. How are you? Let's start with that.
So good. And actually, the reason I feel so good right now is very closely tied to the topic of today. So as you know, we've been taking a slow and steady approach, but very recently we made someone who's been on the team for 3.5 years a very officially first-time full-time person. And we're also officially hiring for a senior full-time role. So after all these years, it just feels so good, like seeing that happen. So it's just been on a high because of that since a few weeks.
I can imagine. And of course, I mean, you're hiring at the moment, so I know a lot of people listening might be interested in that. Maybe we should just kind of give that a little plug at the outset.
Yes, we're hiring a head of community and events, and it's a super visible role. So it will be a role that is very member facing. It's also very strategic, and obviously I'm biased, but it's also like super fun and super impactful. And if you go on my LinkedIn, you'll see that I shared that job post. Also, if you go on the community club job board, you'll also see the job there. Yay!
Yeah, I'm sure the best candidates will come from the community club. So.
Like a lot of really fantastic candidates have come from community club already. So we're looking forward to talking to more.
Amazing. Well, yes, good luck with that. I don't have a good segue, so I'm just gonna jump into our our questions. So today we're talking about slow and steady growth of Dreamers and Doers, but I thought it would be a good idea to kind of get like a high level overview of what Dreamers and Doers is, if you haven't kind of come across it in the wild before. What are some of the characteristics of your community?
Yes, so we are an award-winning community and diverse ecosystem, and we amplify extraordinary entrepreneurial women through PR opportunities, authentic connection, and high-impact resources. So how that looks like is we accept members once a quarter, and we'll dive into that more because that's closely tied to the topic of slow and steady. And we curate for diverse women. So it could be founders, it could be someone who has raised a lot of venture funding, someone who never intends to raise venture funding. It could be someone who works at a startup, an investor, a journalist. So anyone who's part of kind of the wider entrepreneurial ecosystem. And we believe that's what helps make women much more successful by having this diversity. So we have that private collective, but we also have in a jobs platform, we have nearly 35,000 women there. So that's also another part of that ecosystem where we feel like with that underlying thesis of bringing women together to achieve more, but doing that through various verticals.
I love that idea. I mean, just the whole premise of kind of women uplifting women it's amazing. And it's something that's so close to my heart. So I'm not going to fangirl too much. Moving on to the next question. So Dreamers and Doers origin story. This is something that I'm fascinated in. I mean, you weren't working in community at the time. Where did the idea even come from? Tell us a little bit about that.
I love that question. And sometimes it gets like, I get this question like, how did you come up with this like brilliant idea? And the answer is that the idea found me and that I found the idea. So the background, exactly as you stated, I used to be at a hedge fund. I worked for 5 years in finance on an investment side. Then I actually worked for a few early stage startups, but none of them, if you look at them, you wouldn't think that I had any community background. When I found myself working on my very first company, I had a lot of problems in the sense that starting a company from scratch is really, really hard. And if you're a man or woman, it's like very hard. If you have a background in finance and early stage startups, like nothing will prepare you for going out on your own. And I think I see that common thread with some of the most high impact communities, that there's a common pain point that ties community members together. So our common pain point was starting a company, having existential fears, and in our case, also being a woman. That we didn't even intend for this to be female focused, but as I was building my company, I realized that I had a really hard time finding other women who were in similar shoes, at least at that time I did. And some of the issues I was facing were very specific to my gender, and some of my male counterparts just couldn't relate, even though I learned so much and we supported each other, but it was just a whole different ballgame. So that's the very early stages. And how day one looked like was brunch. So we had a work brunch, me and one other woman, and we sat down, we talked about work, we supported each other, and that was the early beginnings. And I love sharing that because so often we compare kind of someone's middle or end to our beginnings, and our beginnings looked nothing like how the community looks like today. So it started with that one brunch that I kept doing every weekend, and one person turned into 2, into 3, into 5. Eventually, I added a Facebook group to make it a little easier to connect, and we can dive into that a little bit further. And a year into it, while I had so many other people tell me like, oh, you're working on these like different business ideas, but perhaps you should work on that community you're working on. And I kept saying, no way, it's a community. It's not a business. Like I can't. And, but a year into it, it had taken off so much that from a timing perspective, I either had to go all in or stop working on it, but also I was seeing the huge impact the community was having, and I could not work on it. But it clearly was also my kryptonite. Like it was the one thing I couldn't stop working on versus but other business ideas that, weren't terrible. The ideas are cheap. We most of us know that the business ideas are interchangeable, but it's what you can actually stick with and persevere with. And Dreamers Doers was the one thing I could not work on.
I love that something so incredible came out of brunch.
Yes.
I feel like good things happen at brunch.
Exactly. Big proponent.
So what I do kind of want to unpack is why you initially started with Facebook as a kind of a hub for your community. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. So initially it was not very intentional in some ways. And I think that's actually not even a bad thing. And we can dive into that further too. But it seemed like the most natural transition. Like, hey, we are connecting with each other offline. But, oh, you mentioned this great resource you want to share. And, oh, you wanted to make that introduction. Like, so it was a way for us to stay in touch in between the get-togethers. And Facebook was just like so easy to do. And at this point, we've actually switched over to Circle, which was a huge deal because we were like, after 7 years, like switching platforms is hard. But we had wanted to do it like much sooner. But what I tell people who are considering platforms, there's a lot of things that are fantastic about Facebook. And one of them is how easy it is to set up. The second thing is engagement is actually decently high because people oftentimes use it already, are familiar. And the third part is growth. So most white label or any other independent platforms, it's really unlikely that someone will just stumble upon your community. But one community, for example, we still have on Facebook is our jobs group. And I spend 0.1% of my time on that community. And it has organically grown to 35,000 women. We do have one person who is freelance who helps like moderate it a bit, but it would have never grown that much if it wasn't on Facebook. Other individuals are able to add each other, tag each other. It's, probably shows up as a recommended group. So there's something really powerful about that. And that's why we haven't moved that group over. But there's like pros and cons with every platform, but Facebook does have its benefits, even though it also has a lot of cons.
I mean, so people are there, right? I mean,
Yes.
your target audience or your target kind of member is already on Facebook. So that makes a lot of sense.
That helps. I will just add though, like why we switch, because I think it's helpful for anyone who wants to go to nitty gritty. It's like the moment
For sure.
you should be like, some people will want to go to your community and then they get sidetracked, by seeing other posts in the news feed, right? So you don't have, especially if you're a paid premium community, that's tricky. And you also can't, a lot of the group features aren't as advanced if that's the main thing you want to really emphasize and have a high impact community.
Yeah, I totally get that. When I go on Facebook, and that's fairly rarely at this point, I mean, I'll just end up kind of scrolling. Even if I had a particular goal in mind, I will just kind of be there for ages. So that makes a lot of sense. Let's get into the meat of the matter, slow and steady growth. Was that something that you kind of instinctually knew was the right way to go, even though you didn't really kind of set out, to build this community?
Part of the answer is yes, and part of the answer is like we figured it out the hard way. So we were growing Dreamers Doers like somewhat organically, and actually all of it's more or less organically. But initially we took a bit of a more traditional startup approach, and I think this is something that I see very intertwined, like Dreamers Doers, a community, but also Dreamers Doers, a company. And I think especially with the emergence of more communities being businesses, like it's just like so intertwined. But we took a traditional approach to community and startups that involved, we had a CTO who's amazing and still a member up to this day. We were interviewing with incubators like Y Combinator. And in some ways, depending on how you measure us, like you could view that as like the highlight of, our company trajectory. But for me, that was the absolute low light. And the reason for that is like, as we were interviewing for Y Combinator, and we were essentially we were trying to fit this box of a venture fundable company. And usually that nearly always means growth at all costs, right? And the times have changed. Now there are a lot of venture funded communities. And I think there's a way of doing that. But at that time, I didn't see a way of growing this authentically and taking venture funding. Like I had dropped everything else in my life to work on this community because I genuinely cared about the women. And I didn't want it to be just a numbers game. Like I knew everyone individually, and it wasn't about like, hey, how can we grow this like crazy? How can we like, make all this money and make that the number one priority? So what we did is we took a step back and said like, okay, so we know we want this to work, but we have no idea what we want this exactly to be, right? But I knew a few things. So I wanted it to be self-sustaining. So what model do we use? So anywhere from like, should it be a nonprofit? Should we do sponsorships? Should we do, all these different things? And we intentionally decided to monetize early, and we decided intentionally to monetize through ongoing memberships. And the reason we did that was because that would make us most accountable to our members, right? Because like if we take outside sponsors, there's nothing wrong with that. But our number one interest and stakeholders will be the corporate partners and not our members.
Absolutely.
We decided if we do members first, like we can probably get sponsors after if we decide to do that. But that's what we care most about, and that's why we want to optimize that. So the infrastructure we pick is so important for how that will manifest in the culture of our community. And we also wanted to monetize early to make sure that what we were building was actually valuable. Like I was dedicating my entire life to this, and it's easy to be like, yes, this is valuable. But like if it's actually valuable, you need to be willing to pay. And that was a really hard struggle, actually deciding to pay, and we'll dive into that as well. But so that was one of the early beginnings. And then from there, obviously, there's like so many paths that you as a community leader and entrepreneur can pick. Like, oh, should I try to like invest all my resources, time, energy, money in trying to acquire new members? Or what should I be doing? And I think this came down to my own personality. And I think it's so important to dive deep into like what's most important to you. And my superpower happens to be to be really detailed and to be really empathetic, right? So for me, it just came naturally that I was just always obsessed with making the experience amazing. And I'm sure we've grown maybe in some ways slower, but it's also led to us investing zero in traditional marketing up to this day. So what happens is like members will have a good experience or great experience, hopefully in most cases, and they are the ones who will refer members, and to a point where they're like so grateful that they get to refer their members, new friends or like members, who then can become essentially paying members. But like for them, that's nearly like a gift and a privilege to be able to do that. And the way we've been able to establish that is by just really focusing on the experience. So in Steady, we accept members only once a quarter. They have to fill out an extensive application. I'm 1,000% sure we lose some people because they have, sometimes they apply right after we accept it and they have to wait 3 months, right? And then they have to fill out this long application. And why not just apply for another community that has a shorter application? Maybe it's even at a lower price point, and they can just join right away, right? So, but what's beautiful about it is we get members who really want to be there and who really cherish being part of the community and who really understand what the community is about because they went through this long application where we explain what the community is about. So it really you could call it like turning a bug into a feature. So by having all these things, it really becomes like a part of the fiber of our community. And up to recently, even like a year and a half ago, you couldn't even find the application on our website. You needed to fill out an initial application and then you got an invite to apply. We stopped that because it was just like too many hurdles. And then we thought we'd miss out on some really high quality individuals, but that's what we've done. And we have this really fun graph I actually shared with you, and I'm always happy to share that, but of how our membership growth has been. And it's really funny. It's like it goes up, but like very gradually. And because we accept members only every quarter, it goes down a little bit and then up, down a little bit, up. And I'm sure like for some people, it might go like this. But, I think especially with communities, if you want to have a high impact community where culture is important, it's important to invest in onboarding. It's important to be intentional. And it's really hard to do that with high growth. I could talk about this so much more, but I'll pause here for a second.
I'm absolutely fascinated by this, and I feel like we could talk about this for about 2 hours, but I'm not going to keep you for that long. You have kind of touched on this, but I'd like to kind of find out in the early stages of your kind of community building, what did that slow and steady growth look like? Like, what were you doing day to day to make that a reality?
Inherent with slow and steady growth, I think, is owning a lot of the things pretty long as the leader/founder, right? Like it's really easy at the beginning to be like, how do I scale this? Like, who do I put in different roles? And I've actually never done this role myself. And I'll be the first to say, like, it's hard, right? Like, and sometimes I question, like, am I going too slow? Am I not good at this? Like, and there's no one right answer. Like, maybe, there is a scenario where I say, like, this I could have done faster, but if I had done that faster, what would have been the outcome, right? But besides that, so I think definitely, one huge benefit is just being really familiar. And we keep hearing this, that, like, members love the high touch and the high quality. And it's really hard to do when you're just like, hey, these 5 people come on board, and hey, we need to hit all these numbers so that we can afford you. And also, like, hey, I'm not able to give you that oversight and onboarding. So it just is a little trickier to do, especially in a community context where what you're doing are like you're supporting humans, and versus like maybe there's some other models if you're like, creating a widget, right? Like, I think there's like, it really depends on what you're working on, but it has a strong impact, especially for communities. So for us, it was that gradual growth. And at the beginning, actually knowing everyone. And then over time, only like putting systems in place that obviously even though we're slow and steady, we still scale, right? But maybe like it's just a different numbers game. And in some ways, it's also like the growth is just more consistent, for lack of a better word. I feel like a lot of communities that focus on growth only have like some quarters or periods where they grow really quickly and then really slowly. And for us, like we try to match the growth with the operations we have in place.
Gesche, I have lost your video. I don't know. Can you still see me?
I still see you.
Okay, well, let's just keep going. I think what you're saying is more important then. I mean, as long as we can still hear you, that is the most important part, as much as I love looking at you. Okay, so we touched on that question. Let's talk a little bit about the transition to a paid community. You've touched on this as well. So was it kind of, as soon as you moved on to Circle, you transitioned to that kind of paid model, or was it something you were doing earlier? I'd love to find out how that worked and how you kind of dealt with all of the various stakeholders, internal and external, who may not have been fully on board with the decision.
Yes, so I will take a step back and kind of like show the timeline. So Dreamers Doers started nearly 8 years ago, and I went full-time about a year into it, and we started monetizing a year after that. And we moved over to Circle this year. So to give like a rough sense. And the nice part too is we became ramen profitable within a few months. But obviously it's easy to be like, oh, it was just a few months, but not accounting for that we'd been running it 2 years prior for that.
Yeah, of course.
So since it started by accident, like obviously everyone who initially joined didn't pay and was never communicated like that this would be a paying community. Plus, backtracking like 5 years ago, like at the time when we started monetizing, paid communities weren't as common as they are now. So I feel like there was a bigger stigma. It was like just some people might have thought it was really weird, and including ourselves myself as a leader. And being driven to build a community, you're also very empathetic. You want to help people, you want to support them. So I had a very hard time deciding to monetize.
Yeah.
And the way I overcame that is by understanding why I had such a hard time charging. And I had a hard time because I felt like, oh, I'm taking away from people. I'm doing something quote unquote bad. And then I flipped it and I said, if I don't charge, like that's the most selfish thing I could do, because I have like all these like feelings, like I'm feeling so bad about charging and I'm giving into those feelings nearly in an indulgent way, indulging myself. And then I'm not charging. And for that reason, like I'm depriving our members of what this community could be, right? Like they could benefit so much more if we charge, if we can invest resources. And by me not getting over myself, we're not able to do that. Then also understanding that we're not forcing anyone to pay. It's not that we put a gun to their head. Like either they can pay, they have the option of paying, or they don't. So that helped too. And what the concept I like is thinking about like free doesn't equal free. So you might have community A that's free and community B that isn't. And then someone invests time in community A and actually ends up being much more costly than if they had just paid for community B that's much more thoughtful, much more high impact. And also if you aren't charging, so either maybe the quality isn't as high, is a potential risk, or if you aren't paying, like how is this community being financed? They might be financed in a way that actually might be harmful to you because they, want to benefit from you in some other way. So
yeah, absolutely.
As you can see, lots of soul searching, but eventually I'm really happy about the outcome.
I love that. I mean, because that's so interesting, because it's quite at odds initially with your community approach, as you say, because you cared so much about your members and you wanted them to get so much out. But that mindset shift is amazing because you were able to give them so much more by making it a paid community.
Exactly.
And I mean, you were devoting your life to Dreamers and Doers. So,
and I laugh because like now people like take community leaders seriously, but at the time I joked like, oh, I quit my hedge fund job to run a Facebook community for free. This is what I do now, you know, obviously big identity shift. And people would always ask like, how's that project going? Like, what else are you working on? And you obviously aren't doing this full time. And little did they know, like every waking second I was, you know, spending on this in a very unhealthy manner. But yes, so I committed my entire life to it at that time.
I love that. Like, how's your little project going?
Exactly.
Like your scrapbooking or something.
Yeah.
Okay, so we did have some questions from the community. Some folks sent in questions. If anyone watching live, there is a chat as well. So if you kind of want to send in questions now, please do that. I will just say though that the first box that pops up, we tested this. The first box that pops up looks like it's asking you for your question, but it's actually asking for your name. So if you don't want your first question to be your name, put your name in first. We're going to get so many like little chats, people's names just popping up in the chat. I hope that's how it works. Okay, Gesche, let's talk about some communities that you admire.
Yes. I'm really inspired by a community called YPO. And
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised if like actually not that many people have heard of it, but it's been a community that's been around since I want to say maybe the 50s. And it might even be a nonprofit. And a lot of community models right now are actually in some ways borrowed or inspired by YPO. And they've first of all, they're really intentional about who they're for and have a very strict criteria. And I think that can sometimes be helpful. And so the short version is like it's for very advanced business individuals who oftentimes feel very lonely. But it's nice that everyone knows like exactly why they're there. And they obviously have a very strong pain point and they have a lot to gain from each other. And they have various offerings, including like conferences and all of that. But what is most fascinating is that they have a concept called forums. And it's this format where up to 10, I think it's always 10 people get together, I think once a month, roughly for 4 hours. I might be butchering it because I'm not actually a member, but I've just been studying it. But like, I think it's 4 hours and everyone gets trained on a very specific format, like very hands-on training on how to communicate. And it's so special because it's one big part of it is like the accountability, like you have to attend. If you, I think, skip even just once, like you're out, or maybe once is the only time you can. And the way you share, it's like very intimate, so that by having these 4 hours together, like the glue of that community is so strong, and the way that you can like share and support each other is just so powerful. And they have a nice concept too, where they actually involve the spouses too. And I think that makes it also just really, really high impact. So I'm really inspired by them, and I think any community leader can gain some learning lessons from YPO, Young Presidents.
YPO. Okay, I'm going to go Google them now because I'm absolutely fascinated. So they have kind of events all over the world, all over the country, or is it only in one specific place?
All over the world. And then I think a few times a year, like you can travel and get together, and then you'd have a local YPO forum with 9 other peers. And it just like, it's very involved, but like it really, shows strong results because of that.
That is intense. Okay. I'm fascinated. I'm going to go and Google them as soon as we get off the call. Okay. Completely different tack here. Community metrics. So let's say you only track one metric. If you could only track one metric, what metric would you be tracking and why?
Referrals. And referrals, it's not even like it's not about growth, but I believe because members are vouching for our community and it's a paid community, that is a really, really strong indicator in terms of like how good of an experience they're having. Because it's so easy to be like, hey, I'm going to track how many comments we have or how many posts. But sometimes like people who aren't active at all, they still have such a great experience that they'll refer. So I think that's a really good metric to indicate the health of the community. One thing that's been extremely powerful is we started doing an annual survey a few years ago. And we like doing it annually because we can go all in, try to get as many members as possible, and then also then use it throughout the year to implement strategy. I personally find it a little bit tricky sometimes to do like a lot of surveys, but that's what's worked for us. And what we do there too, like we ask one question, like how disappointed would you be if you could no longer benefit from this community? It's actually a really powerful question.
Good question.
Has to do with product market fit. If 40% or more say very disappointed, the thought is that you have product market fit. So I'd look like product market fit survey. If you look up first round capital, it's fantastic. Superhuman wrote an article, but so we have a few questions there. So you asked number one. So number one is referral, but number two would be doing a survey like that. And it's so easy to get lost in little data points, but not actually have like an overarching view. And I feel like that survey that we do once a year that has a lot of different questions really helps us get a pulse on how we're doing. And one reason to only do it once a year, I think it's so easy to, especially if you're an empathetic person, to like take things to heart a lot. And sometimes it's nice like to dive really deep and have a hard look at yourself in the mirror. We do this anonymous, by the way, the survey. And then to take the rest of the year to just execute and not go crazy on like minute to minute data points that you get, and just, focus on providing value.
Getting back to referrals, is that kind of the main way that you experience growth at Dreamers and Doers? Or are there other kind of...
Yes, and I'd say a large part, because even so members have like a forum where they can refer members, but then members can also, or potential members can then also fill out a form even without being referred. But even for individuals who fill out a form and haven't officially been referred, the vast majority of time, they'll say like, hey, for all these years, I've kept hearing good things about Dreamers and Doers. Or like I saw someone or heard someone on a podcast. So yes, referrals, but like in a very broad range of referrals. Like usually because we are a premium product, also because we ask a lot of potential members in terms of like a long application, like it has helped to hear multiple times from existing members. But we try to make it slightly easier to apply by, making the forum accessible, and also finding organic ways for members to want to share. So one great thing is to spotlight your members as much as possible. And if they have a great experience, they'll be excited to then use that spotlight to, talk about their experience or just reshare it because they're proud to be part of your community.
That's awesome. So that's like referrals, both direct and indirect.
Exactly.
That's really powerful. Yeah. Okay, my favorite question. What are your go-to engagement players? I know you wrote a fantastic blog about this for us. It's on the Console blog if anyone wants to check it out. But yes, your favorite engagement players, tell us about them.
I put it in a few categories. One is having certain traditions. So when we have new members join, this is a pretty common one, but like nudging them to post introductions and making that part of the onboarding. So having that, especially at the beginning, right when someone joins and is still like unsure or is like trying to find their way, it's good to have some prompt for them to start engaging and for existing members to get to know them. And really important there, one core thing we do is we have a dedicated person, or actually a few, who read through the introductions and tag other relevant members. And some of the most life-changing connections have come just out of that. In addition to that, we are really active with our engagement ourselves as a team, and we tag members all the time, and that really helps for members to notice posts that are relevant for them. And we try to share engagement posts. And what that looks like for us is like we will share a post that has some sort of prompt that will nudge members to engage. And one great example is like within Circle, we have a few spaces, and one space specifically is an ask space. So even though we have a dedicated ask space, we like putting a prompt out every now and then saying like, what asks do you have? So in some ways, it could seem really counterintuitive, like, oh, this is so unnecessary. Why are you doing that? Because members can already post asks. But sometimes it just helps to put a post that reminds them like why asking is important and where they can put them, but also you can just put it in a thread. And someone who's maybe on the verge or wasn't sure if it's important enough or wasn't thinking about it, it's just a nudge to like chime in on this thread. And such beautiful things come out of it. So we try to do that quarterly. Then we always try to put in engagement based on like some of our culture. So one of our core values is like genuine positivity. So we have a regular engagement post on bragging because that's a core part of our culture. We also have one of our values is authentic vulnerability. So we have a post where members get to share a bit, but we always try to put in the post kind of why we're sharing it, or like, hey, this is in line with this. Similar to like any corporation or company, small or big, like values need to be repeated regularly in order to like really be understood and lived. So that's why we try to do that. And I'll give some pro tips on like what not to do. So I think it's engagement is hard no matter what, but like anything that's too complicated is really tricky. Like, hey, like if I need to think really hard, like to just understand what you're asking me to do as a prompt, I probably won't like it. It will lower engagement. Doesn't mean it's a no, because there's some value sometimes in something more complex, but you will usually get less engagement. And anything also that might seem too forced is also tricky. And really quick and easy ones are like, hey, depending on the nature of your community, but like, share your LinkedIn. And it's just a good way for members to like quickly learn a little bit about each other. And it's so easy to do. And you might not even know, like maybe even add a sentence on like what you do work-wise, but just any opportunity that has members discovering each other and connecting with each other is powerful. And it's easy. The easier it is to engage, usually the more engagement you get.
I love that. That's incredible. And I'd love to touch on something that you actually kind of mentioned at the beginning of this question. In terms of kind of tagging members, when you mentioned tagging people in intros and kind of tagging, I mean, I understand obviously tagging someone's looking for a job and someone posts a job, ad that might be suitable. That makes sense. But like, how do you know in an intro when to kind of tag other members? Is it kind of that they have something in common or they work in the same industry? So
I think for one, it's how you prompt members to post the introduction, like how much you have to work with in terms of tagging, right?
I see.
So we have pretty involved introductions, which doesn't work for every community. And even for our community, sometimes it's like a big hurdle and intimidating, but we have like suggestions and like, hey, include, some struggles, include ask, include offers, include all these things. And it works for us, but like I wouldn't recommend it necessarily for everyone. But even a shorter introduction, usually you can be like, oh, you're based in Atlanta. Like, oh, you went to this school. Oh, you love surfing. Oh, you're in this vertical. Oh, you need to hire that. So like, no matter what, like you'll find a few things. And so this is where the back end is important. As part of our lengthy application, we collect a decent amount of information. So we have a pretty robust directory. So some of it, like, because we're so high touch, some of it, like, I read through and I probably already have at least 5 people I want to tag just by being so active in the community. But in addition to that, we'd go back and then look in our directory, like, hey, who has this keyword? And then we try to like really vet and ideally make sure that it is a good fit. And then we tag a few people through that. Sometimes we'll also do a search function in the groups because maybe someone, mentioned surfing in their introduction a while ago, but didn't mention in their directory entry. And then we can sometimes find them and tag them that way. And for tagging, I love always giving disclaimers because like if you're not 100% sure if, this person's a good fit, be like, oh, this person might be interested. Like you don't want to put people like too much on the spot sometimes. One, because they might be busy or because like your intel, like it's only so much that you can tell, like if they, will actually jive.
Exactly. And that ties in kind of with what you said earlier about kind of you don't want things to seem too forced. If something seems forced in terms of engagement, people are going to be immediately...
and everything in life, honestly, right? Like even applying for jobs and just be like, I'm the perfect candidate. I can't wait for you to view me. Like, sometimes it's like a little bit off, it can be, but versus like, if it's fit, I really look forward to talking. Like just changes the dynamic. It's kind of, EQ basically, which I've had to work on hard and all of us do, is such a great and learned skill for community and so many other aspects of life.
Absolutely. We have had a question from Jenny. Hey, Jenny, nice to see you. Well, just to see you popping up in our little chat box. How did you decide on the membership price point for your community? That is a very good question.
So it's an amazing question, an ever-evolving answer or pricing. And at the beginning, so we've increased prices over time, so that's really important to mention. I think for most communities or any offerings, that will be the case, that whatever you start with is probably not where you'll be at in a few years. In our case, we grandmother our members into the price that they joined, and new members, unless like sometimes there's like some exceptions, but I'll keep it kind of simple. And there's this fantastic article that I love that I base this very scientific approach on. And I think it's in Forbes if you like Google like happy price. But basically this article said to offer pricing and at a price that makes you happy to provide your services. So it's not scientific at all is the answer. But I like this approach because it's so easy to like overcomplicate things. And depending on what your offerings are, like you might have or your personal approach, personal preference, like our approach isn't definitely the right approach for everyone. But I like doing that. Like the moment I realize where it becomes a slug and I'm like actually not enjoying providing our offerings anymore, it's usually when we increase prices. So it's like a gut feeling nearly of like, hey, like this just doesn't, it feels like we're giving away more than we're receiving in some ways. It needs to be an equal relationship. In addition to that, one of the core things we offer are PR opportunities. So there's where it can be a little bit more scientific, where like, okay, where are other communities priced that are maybe in the similar field, and what are we offering? What would be the alternatives? And frankly, right now we're like crazy underpriced for the PR opportunities. So that's something we're working on as well. And pricing is also a feature. So we intentionally are hoping to be priced at a premium compared to most communities within our field, just because that's the approach we take with like slow and steady. Like we don't want like to play a numbers game. So very intentionally, that nearly becomes a feature, and members self-select, right? Like someone on purpose also, that's why the minimum amount that you can sign up for is a quarter and not a month. Because someone who, like, yes, we would get extra individuals if we did a month, but who are these extra individuals that otherwise wouldn't have signed up? And the only reason they signed up is because they could do a month versus 3 months. Like everything, like impacts everything, like the butterfly effect.
Yeah, quality over quantity. Yes. I nearly said it the wrong way.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, that's what we're talking about. Okay, the last question that I have, and then I will let you go and get on with your crazy life. What do you think are the most essential skills for a community manager?
Wow. I'm simplifying it on purpose because anyone who is a community manager / leader knows it's very, very complex. So on purpose, I will simplify it. So one part is obviously that human touch. I think we all know, like community leaders are completely undervalued for what, the amazing skill set. But like EQ is so important. And EQ, by the way, can be very much learned. I learned so much over the years. And really being obsessed to figure it out. But like you need that obsession in order to figure out what works for your particular community. What do people react to, what not? And in some ways, like nearly feel pain when you don't get it right. Like, so being highly empathetic really, really helps. So that's like kind of on the, people like calling it soft skills. I would actually I'd like to call it hard skills.
It bugs me so much when people do that.
And then on the other side, it's completely underestimated how operations heavy communities are. And obviously, I'm not even going to touch on strategy because strategy is super important. But the operational flow, because you can get so overwhelmed. So you need to have underlying well-running operations in place to be able to manage individuals and to be able to have the biggest impact possible. So everything from new initiatives, like how do you structure it? How do you, make sure that it still feels personalized and is personalized? There's just so much operations that goes into it, and it's the baseline to be able to have a high impact community.
Amazing. Some pro tips for anyone interested in applying for the role that you're hiring for at the moment.
Exactly.
But that's a head of community. Am I right?
Head of community and events, yes.
Okay. Amazing. Gesche, thank you so much. That was incredible. I feel like we got so much out of that quick chat. But yeah, if you didn't catch the whole thing, for anyone watching, we are going to post this soon. We'll share the link in Community Club and on our socials. But yeah, Gesche, thank you so much for hanging out with us and spending some time with us. And it's been wonderful chatting to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm so grateful and so happy for Community Club. It's been life-changing. When we started doing community, it felt very lonely. And I'm just like, first of all, you do an incredible job running community, but the resources and like the way you celebrate community leaders, like I recommend it to every single community leader I meet. It's just such an amazing resource. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for doing what you're doing and how you're doing it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for saying that. It's made me, I feel a little warm and fuzzy now.
It's so true. Thank you.
Thanks, Gesche. I'm sure we'll see you around the community.
Yes, you will.
Take care. Bye.